In the early hours of September 2nd, 1866, a cow kicked over a lantern in a small barn on Decoven Street. Within hours, Chicago was burning. But this is not a story about Chicago. This is a story about what happened 2 centuries earlier, on a Sunday morning in September, when a baker named Thomas Fariner went to bed without properly extinguishing his oven. By the time he woke, his house on Pudding Lane was already in flames. And by the time the fire finally died, 4 days later, London had ceased to exist. What rose from those ashes would become the greatest city on earth. But the path from destruction to rebirth was neither straight nor simple. It was paved with ambition and corruption, genius and compromise, grand visions and brutal realities. This is the story of how London burned, how it was rebuilt, and how that rebuilding created the template for the modern city. To understand what was lost, you first have to understand what London was before the fire. By 1666, London was the largest city in England and one of the largest in Europe. Somewhere between 350,000 and 400,000 people lived within its walls and in the sprawling suburbs beyond. It was a city of merchants and craftsmen, of sailors and servants, of aristocrats and beggars. The River Thames was its lifeblood, crowded with ships from every corner of the known world. But London was also a city built for a different age. The streets were narrow and crooked, following paths laid down in medieval times. Buildings leaned toward each other across alleyways so tight that neighbors could shake hands from their upper windows. Almost everything was built of wood, timber frames, wooden walls, thatched roofs. The city was, in the words of one contemporary observer, a tinderbox waiting for a spark. That spark came on September 2nd, 1666. Thomas Fariner was the king's baker, a respectable tradesman who lived and worked on Pudding Lane near London Bridge. Sometime after midnight, a fire broke out in his bakery. The exact cause has never been determined with certainty. Fariner himself insisted that he had properly dampened his ovens before retiring. But fires in bakeries were common, and the most likely explanation is the simplest one. An ember survived. A spark caught. And in a city built of wood, that was enough. Fariner and his family escaped through an upstairs window, climbing across the rooftops to safety. His maid, too frightened to make the crossing, became the fire's first victim. By the time the alarm was raised, the flames had already spread to the neighboring buildings. The response was slow and inadequate. The Lord Mayor, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, was roused from his bed and brought to the scene. His assessment would become infamous. "A woman could piss it out," he reportedly said, before returning home. It was a catastrophic misjudgment. The fire spread with terrifying speed. A strong east wind drove the flames westward through the densely packed streets. The wooden buildings, many of them coated with pitch to keep out the rain, burned like torches. The narrow lanes acted as chimneys, funneling the heat and creating their own winds. By dawn, the fire had consumed hundreds of buildings and showed no signs of stopping. The standard firefighting technique of the era was to create fire breaks by pulling down buildings in the path of the flames. But this required coordination, equipment, and most importantly, the authority to destroy private property. Bloodworth hesitated. Property owners protested, and while they argued, the fire advanced. By Monday, the situation was desperate. King Charles II himself came to the scene, taking personal command of the firefighting efforts. He ordered the creation of fire breaks, overriding the objections of property owners. He worked alongside common laborers, passing buckets and shoveling dirt. But it was too late to save the city. The fire had grown beyond any human ability to control it. On Tuesday, the flames reached their peak. Old St. Paul's Cathedral, the medieval masterpiece that had dominated London's skyline for 5 centuries, caught fire. The lead roof melted and ran down into the streets like a river. The stones themselves exploded from the heat. Booksellers who had stored their inventory in the cathedral's crypt, believing it to be fireproof, lost everything. The greatest church in England was reduced to a smoking ruin. The fire burned for 4 days. When it finally died, on the morning of September 6th, the destruction was almost incomprehensible. 13,200 houses had been destroyed. 87 churches were gone. 44 livery halls, the headquarters of the city's powerful trade guilds, had burned to the ground. The Royal Exchange, the Custom House, Newgate Prison, 3 city gates, and countless other public buildings were nothing but rubble and ash. The official death toll was remarkably low. Only 6 people were recorded as having died in the fire. But this number is almost certainly a dramatic undercount. The poor left no records. The homeless and the transient were not missed. Modern historians believe the true death toll was likely in the hundreds, perhaps higher. More than 100,000 Londoners were now homeless. They camped in the fields north of the city, in Moorfields and Islington, huddled in makeshift shelters, wondering if they would ever return to their homes. The economic damage was estimated at £10 million, an almost unimaginable sum at the time, equivalent to many billions in modern currency. London, the greatest city in England, had been erased, but even before the embers had cooled, the rebuilding had begun. King Charles understood that the fire presented an opportunity as well as a catastrophe. London could be rebuilt, not as it had been, but as it should be. A modern city, with wide streets and brick buildings, with proper sanitation and fire prevention. A city worthy of a great nation. Within days of the fire's end, the king received several proposals for a completely redesigned London. The most famous came from Christopher Wren, a young astronomer and architect, who would later become the most celebrated builder in English history. Wren proposed a radical new plan: wide boulevards radiating from central plazas, grand public spaces, and a rational grid of streets. It was beautiful, ambitious, and completely impractical. The problem was property rights. London's land was owned by thousands of individuals, each with legal claims that predated the fire. To implement Wren's plan, or any of the other grand schemes, would have required the Crown to seize private property on a massive scale. It would have meant years of legal battles, enormous expense, and political chaos. Charles, who had only been restored to the throne 6 years earlier, after a civil war and a decade of Republican rule, could not afford such a confrontation. Instead, the rebuilding followed a more pragmatic path. The Rebuilding Acts of 1667 and 1670 established new standards for construction. Buildings were to be made of brick or stone, not wood. Streets were to be widened. Building heights were regulated based on the importance of the street. The medieval chaos would not be entirely eliminated, but it would be tamed. The man charged with overseeing this transformation was Robert Hooke, a polymath genius who served as the city's surveyor. Hooke worked with tireless energy, surveying plots, settling disputes, and ensuring that the new regulations were followed. He was assisted by a small army of surveyors and inspectors, all working to impose order on the chaos of reconstruction. The rebuilding took decades. By 1671, most of the houses had been rebuilt, but the public buildings took longer. The new Royal Exchange opened in 1669. The Custom House was completed in 1671. The livery halls were rebuilt one by one, each guild financing its own headquarters. And then there was St. Paul's. Christopher Wren had been appointed to design a new cathedral even before the fire, when the old building was already in desperate need of repair. The fire simplified his task by eliminating the old structure entirely. But it also raised the stakes. The new St. Paul's would be the symbol of London's rebirth, a statement of national pride and religious devotion. It had to be magnificent. Wren's first design was rejected as too radical. His second design was approved in 1675, though Wren continued to modify it throughout the construction process. The foundation stone was laid on June 21st, 1675. The last stone was set in place in 1711, 36 years later. Wren, now 79 years old, watched as his son Christopher placed the final stone on the lantern atop the dome. The cathedral that Wren built was unlike anything England had seen before. Its great dome, inspired by St. Peter's in Rome, rose 365 feet above the streets of London. The interior was vast and luminous, a space designed to inspire awe and contemplation. It was, and remains, a masterpiece of English architecture. But Wren did not build only St. Paul's. In the decades after the fire, he designed 51 parish churches to replace the 87 that had been destroyed. Each was unique, adapted to its site and its congregation. Some were grand, with soaring spires that punctuated the London skyline. Others were intimate, tucked into narrow lots, their beauty revealed only to those who stepped inside. Together, they transformed the character of the city. The London that emerged from the Great Fire was fundamentally different from the city that had burned. It was still crowded, still noisy, still chaotic in many ways. The medieval street plan survived largely intact, despite the grand visions of Wren and others. But the buildings were different. Brick and stone replaced wood. Wider streets allowed light and air to penetrate. Fire codes and building regulations, enforced by an army of inspectors, prevented the worst abuses of the old system. The fire also transformed how Londoners thought about their city. Before 1666, fire was simply a fact of urban life, an unavoidable hazard to be endured. After the fire, it became a problem to be solved. Insurance companies emerged to spread the risk of fire damage. Fire brigades were organized to respond to outbreaks. Building codes were strengthened and enforced. The Great Fire taught London, and through London, the world, that cities could be made safer through planning, regulation, and collective action. The psychological impact was equally profound. The fire became a foundational myth of London, a story of destruction and rebirth that shaped how Londoners understood themselves and their city. The monument, a 202-foot column designed by Wren and Hooke, was erected near the site where the fire began. Its inscription blamed the fire on the treachery and malice of the Popish faction, a claim that was politically useful, but historically false. The fire was an accident, not a conspiracy. But the need to find meaning in catastrophe, to assign blame, and to draw lessons, was too powerful to resist. The London that rose from the ashes of 1666 would go on to become the capital of the largest empire in human history. It would survive plague and war, revolution and reform. It would be bombed nearly to rubble during the Second World War and rise again, as it had risen before. The resilience that the Great Fire revealed, and the institutions it created, would prove to be London's greatest inheritance. Christopher Wren died in 1723, at the age of 90. He was buried in the crypt of St. Paul's Cathedral, the building that had consumed the last 4 decades of his life. His epitaph, written in Latin, translates simply, "Reader, if you seek his monument, look around you." It remains the most fitting tribute ever written to an architect, and it remains true today, 3 centuries later, for anyone who walks the streets of London and looks up at the dome that Wren built, rising above the city that fire could not destroy. We remember the flames. We remember the smoke that swallowed the skyline. But the real story begins after the fire dies, in the decisions that follow, in the compromises between vision and reality, in the quiet labor of rebuilding. London in 1666 proved that cities are not defined by how they fall, but by how they rise. Thank you for watching. Next time, we step into another European capital still trapped in darkness, a city of overcrowded alleys and suffocating medieval slums before it was radically transformed. Paris before Haussmann. Until then.